Hello everyone, my name is Cherie, and if you're new to my channel, welcome. Today I am making Simplicity 8872, and I thought that I would make this pattern today because there's a lot of graduations going on and I wanted to have something nice to wear. I also thought that it would be the perfect opportunity to show you the things that you need to know before attempting your first sewing project. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. First things first, you'll want to actually take a close look at your pattern envelope and also remove the pattern directions from the package and read it from start to finish. That way you can have a good idea as to what will be required of you before you get started. And this is an extremely important step that a lot of beginners like to skip, but never do skip this step because it could be disastrous. So on the front of this pattern envelope, we have views A through C. So you'll want to decide which one of the views that you most like and most want to sew, and you'll be sewing from that one. One thing that a lot of beginners don't recognize is that the top of the pattern is separate from the bottom skirt, and you join them together at a later date. This is just the way that garments are constructed, but that gives you a special opportunity to be able to mix and match. So if I liked this top part of this dress, then I could sew the top part of this dress and then choose a different skirt to go with it. Like if I liked view D skirt, then I could sew view D skirt onto this top part and make an entirely different outfit. So you can really get creative with this part and just choose what portions that you like and join those together. The next thing that you're going to want to look at is the back of the pattern envelope. This is where all of the important information is. Now, if you are working with a PDF pattern online, then pretty much the same thing will hold true. They do have directions there, but the directions are integrated into what this envelope is. So you would have all this information and all of this information along with the directions all in one sheet, if you will. Anyways, the fabrics are the first thing that you'll want to look at. And for any beginner, I always think that it is best to look for a pattern with woven fabrics. So like your chambrays, your cottons, your double georgettes, your lightweight linens, those types of fabrics are easiest to work with because they don't have a ton of stretch and a ton of give. And you always want to stick with the fabrics that they suggest for the patterns when you are starting out. Because if you switch those up, you could have a problem. You can get away with doing a knit fabric on a pattern that has woven fabric suggested, but you cannot get away with doing the same thing with a pattern that suggests using knit materials. So that is something very, very important. Always remember to follow this fabric guide very carefully, especially if the pattern suggests using a knit fabric. The next section here is your notions. So, of course, every single pattern is going to have thread, and each view has different things required. Let's say that I was indeed going to do view C bodice, then I would need to look at the notions that are needed for view C and see which ones are needed for the bodice. So for this bodice, it calls for flexible trim or mini pom-pom fringe. So I would need to go to the store and purchase that before starting this project, because the last thing that you want to do is to get in the middle of a project and realize that you don't have all the supplies that you need. At that point, you would either have to run to the store or order it online and wait for a few days for it to arrive, which is a pain in the behind. So it is really important to look at your notions. For me personally, I have pulled some 1/4 inch elastic here, and this is elastic that I purchased during the lockdowns to make masks with, and I just have a bunch of it left. I bet everybody has 1/4 elastic at home that was sewn during that time. Anyways, and this is the thread that I was going to use for the project. The only thing that I have not pulled is my bias binding, because I'm going to make some bias binding from scratch. I'm not going to teach you how to do that in this video, but that is what I plan on doing, and I do have my fabric set aside for that, and we'll talk more about the fabric later. The next section I think is the most important, and that is the body measurements. The measurements that are on the patterns are never going to be like the measurements on ready-made garments in the store. So you will need to measure your body to get the correct measurements for you, and then find the size that most relates to your measurements. The first page of your pattern is always going to be most helpful. You have some line drawings of the actual pattern itself so that you can see the different parts of your garment better. You also have a little legend that tells you what pattern pieces to cut out depending on what view you are sewing. This is very important because otherwise you could accidentally forget to cut out a piece and then be missing a piece when you get ready to assemble. We're going to move to down here at cutting layouts. It shows you how to lay out your fabric depending on the width of your fabric and the view that you're sewing, so that you can fit all your pattern pieces onto the fabric. I used this in the beginning, but I no longer use this when I'm cutting out a pattern because sometimes I find a better way to arrange my pieces than this. You have a layout for both 45-inch fabric and 60-inch fabric. Fabric is usually either 60 inches wide or 45, so you should be able to pick either one of those in order to figure out how to lay out your pattern pieces. Now this section up here is the most important for a beginner because it's a little legend that shows you what the different symbols mean on your pattern pieces, because some pieces are to be cut on the fold while others need to be cut on grain, and those are important things to note because if you don't, then you could not have enough material or cut out your pieces incorrectly. You probably don't realize it, but we've already done a lot without even cutting out any materials. I suggest having some reference books as a beginner. This Singer sewing book is one that I got from Goodwill, and a lot of your thrift stores oftentimes have these beginner sewing books or just general sewing books, and they are really good to have. The reason why I have this Singer sewing book out is because I wanted you to know that virtually none of these commercial sewing patterns out there tell you how to finish the inside of your garment. So you're going to have to finish the inside of your garment so you don't have any frayed edges, and you're going to want to come up with which method that you want to use before you even cut out your pattern, because it's going to make a difference in how you cut your pattern. If you're going to be doing some French seams, for example, see, where are those French seams? Yeah, if you're going to be doing French seams, for example, you may need some extra seam allowance there to be able to create that French seam. So that's something that you would really need to know ahead of time. And I really like this book because I can flip through it. I always use this section too. Flip through it and decide which way I want to finish my fabrics. Like, you could do a straight edge, but you really don't want to do a straight edge unless you are going to serge the ends so that you don't have any frayed edges on a woven fabric. You could also do a straight stitch edge and then sew a zigzag right after that, and then trim it away so that you're left with a zigzag on the edge of the material so that it doesn't fray. Another common method would be to use some pinking shears and sort of shear your material here. There's just a lot of different ways that you could go about finishing out your seams, and this book really goes over all of them. You also have your bound edges where you can do bias binding on the edges, and that's one of the ways that I prefer to do it, because I think that a lot of ready-made garments resort to using a serger, but serger stitches don't necessarily hold up as well over the long term, and they're not necessarily a couture method for making clothes. You'll never find serged edges on a $300 outfit, and because you are making the outfit on your own, the inside finishings are really important because they are what make your garment seem more high class and more expensive. So you really want to take time to make really nice finishings on the insides of your seams there, because it increases the longevity, and because you're putting so much money into buying fabric and then putting so much time into sewing the garment, it really is good to have good finished seams. Okay, so that's that. Let me put that aside. I have this book which is called Fit for Real People. The reason why I've pulled this out is because it shows you how to paper pattern fit. We can't always afford to buy muslin fabric to cut out our garment in an actual fabric first before we actually sew the real thing. So the next best thing that we can do if we can't afford to do that is to actually wear the paper pattern and tie it around yourself so that you can see how it will fit on your body before you actually go and cut into your fabric. And if the paper pattern doesn't fit correctly, then what you can do is you can use tape, like regular Scotch tape, and tape the pieces together or mark on it even to get it to the correct sizing so it fits your body correctly. And then you will cut your fabric out based on how you trimmed up your pattern pieces. So that way you end up with a perfectly fitting garment without having to necessarily cut a muslin. And see, this is a sway back. You see how this back is swaying outwards? We want it to be straight up and down instead of swaying like this. So they have, I think they added some tissue paper here to make it fit correctly. And then once she takes this apart here, I think she's pinned the pattern together, the pattern pieces together, and put it against her body. So now what she will do is just cut out this piece that's been modified on the fabric instead of cutting it out as it was on the paper pattern itself. So that's just one thing to recognize. And if you are able to fit your patterns to your body using paper pattern pieces, then I would highly suggest doing that. That's something that I personally do pretty much all of the time, because it really does get pricey to actually buy a fabric to be able to create a mock-up before actually sewing the garment. Now, if the fabric is really expensive fabric, then I will usually try to find a similar fabric at like a Goodwill or something, an old bed linen or something, and cut that up to make my muslin. But otherwise, I usually just paper pattern fit first. The next thing that we need to talk about is the actual pattern pieces themselves. So I have this pattern here, and of course the pattern instructions tell you to cut out each individual pattern piece in your size, but like I was telling you before, you may have to make alterations to the pattern. So for that reason, I suggest getting you some medical table paper off of somewhere like Amazon and simply tracing out your pattern pieces and cutting them out on this medical table paper. That way, if you ever make any mistakes on your alterations, you can just go back to the blueprint and retrace it without a problem. And then too, there's some other added benefits to doing it this way as well, because let's say you ate too much turkey and you gained weight, then you can come back at a later date and cut a bigger size and remake the same garment over again. Or if you get tired of this pattern, don't want it anymore, then you can sell it online or give it to a friend or exchange it with a friend. There's just so many different things that you can do with old patterns if you don't cut them out. One of the things that I enjoy doing with my patterns is separating them out. So before I mentioned that you have the bodice and then the skirt that are separate and that you join them together to make this dress. So what if you only made the bodice and just added some links to it? Then you would have a winter blouse. Okay, so you can do that. Or what if you only wanted to make the skirt? Then you have a nice skirt to wear. So there's a lot of alterations that you can make to turn this into something completely different. And you could recycle and reuse this same pattern dozens of times, making it look entirely different, because it can be a dress, a blouse, or even a skirt. So when I completed my first sewing project, I royally screwed up because I didn't cut a piece on the fold like it was supposed to be. So basically, when you cut a piece of fabric on the fold, you fold the fabric in half like so, to where you have two layers here. And on this folded edge, you butt the part with this indicator on it against it. And then you will cut around here, leaving this edge, leaving this folded edge right here folded. And then when you finish, you'll have something like this that folds out to become a whole piece. I have this strip of fabric right here, and there's a white mark right here. This white mark right here is called your selvage. And a lot of your pattern pieces have a long line like this with two arrows at the end. That means that you need to align your arrows with that selvage so that they both are parallel. And the reason why you need to do that is because if you don't, then your fabric will be off grain, and when you sew it together, your garment will warp out of shape. So it's very important to align your fabric with the selvage. Now, not all fabrics have a white selvage on it like this. Some of them, like the one that I just put aside earlier, have a frayed end, and that's how you can tell that it's the selvage. And then there are others that have little holes or little dots on the edge of the fabric, and that is the indicator that it is the selvage. So I just thought that I would mention that, because that's yet another thing that a lot of beginners don't get in the beginning and end up screwing up their first sewing project. And I just don't want that to be you. If you haven't already, please do take the time to subscribe to my channel, and also give this video a thumbs up. It really does help out. Once your fabric is cut out, you'll probably have some pieces that say cut one of fabric and one of interfacing, for example. So what you'll want to do is put your interfacing with the glue side facing the wrong side of your fabric, and go ahead and iron all of those. And once you've done that ironing, you'll also want to go over your fabric to make sure that that is pressed out flat as well. Then you'll be ready to head over to your sewing machine and actually sew all of your pieces together. Now, the only thing that we have left to do is to actually sew up the project. And the number one thing that I have to tell you about completing your first sewing pattern is that sewing is all about problem solving. So I ran into a problem when I was cutting out this fabric that I didn't tell you about. I wanted to save the best for last. So I'm going to just show you here. I had this sort of fabric here that I wanted to use for my garment. And I got this fabric a year ago when I went to New Orleans. And I only had 3 5/8 of fabric, but the pattern called for 4 1/4. So I didn't quite have enough fabric to complete the project. So I had to problem solve. And the way that I solved the problem was that I picked view A for the garment, for the bodice part, but then for the skirt, I picked view C, and that saved a little bit of fabric. Then the other thing that I did was for the ruffle that goes down at the bottom here, I actually reduced its size by 1 inch in order to make enough room for me to be able to cut out 3 ruffle pieces, which the pattern called for. So then I had a little bit of extra fabric because I took some height off of this bottom piece. So my skirt's going to be slightly shorter, but that was the way that I chose to solve the problem. The other way that I could have solved this problem would have been to have gone sleeveless, but I don't necessarily like my arms out all the time, so I didn't want to do it that way. But you're always going to run into problems when you are working on a project. So do keep that in mind, and I wish you the best of luck on your very first sewing pattern. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.